The first thing you notice after a divorce when the papers are dry and the neighbors have gone back to their lawns is the sound a house makes when it no longer has your name on it. It isn't louder. It's thinner. Like a choir with one alto missing. Martin kept the mansion the pond with its clean stone rim, the live oaks lit at night like a hotel advertisement. He kept the paintings he chose after telling me I had no eye for color, though I was the one who dusted them every Sunday. He kept the cash, of course swept it clean as a plate after church supper. He was thorough that way, the sort of man who called thoroughness integrity. Judges like thorough men. So do bankers. What I kept was listed on the last page like an afterthought. A tool shed, 60 years old, condition poor, appraised value negligible. The land beneath it was once my mother's before maps were printed in color, and land was divided into the kinds of parcels you could sell with a smile and a pen. I didn't cry when my lawyer slid the final page across the table. I didn't even look at the signature. The ink could belong to anyone. Instead, I folded the papers, tucked them in my purse, and went home to the rental I'd chosen because it was small enough to clean in an hour, and big enough to hold a bed and a table, and the sort of quiet that doesn't pinch. It rained that night. Not the angry kind, just the steady rehearsal of water on a town that knows how to be wet. In the morning, I woke earlier than I meant to, and made tea in a chipped blue mug Grace gave me when Mom passed. The kitchen clock clicked at the top of the hour like a patient clearing his throat. Somewhere a church bell rehearsed 6 slow notes. I thought of how many mornings I'd poured tea in a kitchen that isn't mine anymore, and set the cup on a counter I won't wipe again. I had one errand left before I would be done with the life I didn't choose, the shed. The buyer wanted it cleared. He planned to reimagine the block, a phrase you can only say if you never planted a rose bush. I signed the permission for him to haul it off, boards and all. But something about the way the paper called it worthless, it pricked me. I imagine a woman feels a prick of the same kind when a doctor gestures at a sonogram and uses a word like viable, as if the measure of a thing could be reduced to whether someone else would keep it. So I drove down to the old lot on Harbor Lane where the marsh grass meets the asphalt, and the gulls announced themselves like a brass section. The mansion you could see at the end of the cul-de-sac shined up like a wedding plate. My shed squatted near the side street under a leaning cedar roof sagging like an elderly shoulder. I parked under the cedar and cut the engine. For a while I just listened. Tires on distant wet pavement, a fisherman's radio soft, the little knock-knock of a woodpecker who hadn't yet decided whether I belonged here. Grace would have told me to bring gloves. And a tetanus shot. I had neither. I had the thin jacket I keep by the door, and the purse with a pen that sometimes writes and sometimes doesn't, like a husband who loves you mostly. The door to the shed stuck with the stubbornness of anything consulted only when necessary. I set my shoulder to it and pushed. It answered with a deep-throated groan that put me in mind of the organ at St. Mark's, first sound after the bell, unsure if the music is welcome. Dust swam in the light like a million quiet questions. It smelled of cedar and oil and a little like mice-honest smells. A pull chain dangled near the door, capped with a wooden bead someone had sanded smooth years ago. I tugged it, prepared for nothing. A bulb blinked and considered the honor of the task, then offered a thin, patient light. I stood inside my inheritance, a workbench with a cracked vise, coffee cans of rusted nails, a child's chair in a corner, one back spindle missing, a phonograph with its mouth open as if caught mid-area. A trunk hand-planed brass corners gone green sat under the one window on the only patch of floor that looked like it had been swept in the past 30 years. Part of me wanted to turn around and go sell it for firewood. The other part recognized the weight in the air that comes when objects wait to be found. I said my mother's name aloud, Miriam, just to see if the shed would answer back. It did not. But something loosened in my chest and I breathed easier than I had in weeks. I crossed to the trunk and ran my fingers over the brass. Someone had polished it once. You can tell the difference between neglected shine and shine that has slept. I remembered Mom leaning in the doorway years ago, wiping her hands on an apron that never lost the smell of lemon oil. She taught piano after school back when parents sent children on foot and didn't worry if they were a minute late for supper. She used to keep music stands in here. I hadn't set foot inside much after she died. Martin said he'd see to it when we got serious about maximizing the parcel. He saw to it the way some men see to their hypothetical futures on paper. I knelt. The latch answered easily, a polite little uptick as if it suffered fools. Inside lay a quilt folded wrong side out, the stitching bare to the world like a dressmaker caught mid-hem. The colors were old Southern tobacco, faded indigo milk white, a red so tired it looked like it had said all it needed to. Beneath the quilt was a narrow tin box, and under that 3 shellac records wrapped in brown paper and string. I didn't know what I was looking at yet. Only that my heart did the considerate thing, slowed down so I could hear. I sat on the child's chair and it protested though it held. I ran my hand along the quilt's wrong side and felt where the thread knotted in a way that was not like my mother. She stitched steady as rain. These knots were purposeful, not mistakes. Notes. Outside, a gull complained about the weather, then forgave it. I should have left. I should have closed the trunk and labeled it for the estate sale as miscellaneous textiles, which is what Martin liked to call what he could not value. Instead, I reached for the tin box and felt the quiver you feel before you open an old letter you know will be in a hand you miss. The hinge sang a coppery little note. Inside was an oilskin packet neatly folded. It had the weight of something not meant for the light and the dignity of having waited without whining. I set it on my lap. Stuck to the underside of the tin box was a small brass key round about its teeth, like a sunburst stamped with 3 letters I had to tilt toward the bulb to read W.W. and Sons. I don't know why I whispered, "Oh." I suppose some part of me already knew this shed was not worthless. It was a mouth closed tight for years, and I had my fingers resting on its lower lip, deciding if I would pry it open. I put the key in my pocket. Then I lifted the quilt, still wrong side up, and found a photograph stuck to the trunk's bottom by a circle of dried sap. I peeled it carefully. 4 women stood on a wooden step under a sign that read, Harbor School of Music, 1967. The middle one was my mother, hair pinned up in the way she wore it when she meant business. She held a violin bow like a lit match. Behind them was not this shed, but a clean little building with white trim and clapboard siding and windows that looked like eyes that had learned to be kind. I turned the photo over. In my mother's hand the words, "For whoever comes after." The music stays. I smoothed the quilt over my knees. The wrong side, the stitched side, looked back like a map pretending to be a blanket. Before I realized I'd made a decision, I said out loud, "All right," to no one, which is the same as saying it to the truth. I reached for the oilskin and began to open it. The oilskin gave way the way old manners do, slowly with dignity. Inside there were letters bound with ribbon, and beneath them a stiff folder marked with a blue pencil, Reversion M. Brooks. My mother's maiden name before she married and became Miriam Brooks Hale, as if adding Martin's last name had been a square stitch added to a circle quilt. I left the folder closed for a minute and unbound the letters. The first was from a man whose stationery was so heavy it had its own opinion, Hollis Whitney, Trustee, Harbor Arts Fund. His handwriting had the clean edges of someone taught to sit up straight. Miss Brooks, we confirm receipt of your donation of recordings and instruments, and your request that the Harbor School of Music be named as beneficiary in the event that the Brooks parcel cease to be used for community education. I'll attach the standard reversion language and assure you it will hold long after our hands are too tired to sign our names. HW. Community education. I looked around the shed. The phonograph. The child's chair. My mother's secret was not a lover or a stash of cash or some embarrassment sweated into secrecy. It was a promise. I slipped the letter back and lifted the blue penciled folder. Inside were copies, deeds of trust document, a notarized codicil written in a tidy legal hand, but signed with my mother's crooked M. Brooks, and witnessed by Whitcomb and Whitcomb, attorneys at law. The same name Mr. Whitcomb had on the frosted glass door of the building by the courthouse when I was a girl, when Mama would pay him in installments and bring him brownies with the crinkly top. "What did you do, Mama?" I asked. "And why didn't you tell me?" The answer did not arrive in English. It came by the bulb's soft hum, the cedar's breath, and the knowledge that sometimes a mother does not say everything because the saying would make a daughter choose too soon. I pulled the quilt fully out and shook it gently, and Dust took that personally. I coughed, and then laughed alone like a person who has told the first honest joke all day. When the air settled, I laid the wrong side up and pressed it with my palm. The stitches were not random. They followed lines. The red thread, a deeper run through the pieced blocks, traveled past where a human would put it for prettiness, and instead, where land would insist it go if it had fingers. It wasn't a pattern. It was a map. I imagined my mother piece by piece, night after night, while I fell asleep to scales from the next-door room, and Martin stayed late at the office in the days before. Late at the office meant what it does now. She stitched what she could not file at the courthouse, an account laid in cotton. "W. and Sons," I said, and took the key from my pocket. A memory arrived uninvited and sat down a door with that name painted on wavy glass, a fan turning above a teller who wore his hair like he wanted to reassure you. "That bank closed before my 30th birthday. Another one bought it. Their records went to the county vault where paper is given the dignity of climate control." I rested my hand on the phonograph. The crank was stiff, the way a man gets when he believes you owe him thanks for something he already spent. I lifted the lid and found its felt worn to the wood. The shellac records in the trunk were labeled in pencil: Harbor Children's Choir, 1967 Dedication Recital, Soprano Solo M. Brooks, and a third that simply said, "Donor." I smiled because it was indecent not to. The future was tucked in here like a note under a $1 bill. The floorboard under the workbench was darker, as if oil had confessed there for years. I tapped it with my knuckles and heard the hollow question of a space not yet introduced to air. A bent nail near the bench's leg had been hammered crooked, then pried. I worked it free with the back of a spoon from my purse, one of those things you mean to return to a restaurant and never do. The board lifted with the quiet gasp of a secret consenting to be told. Inside the little coffin of space lay a ledger wrapped in oilcloth. I opened it and found columns that would make a bookkeeper purr. Rentals paid, music lesson fees, donations in small shy amounts from names I recognized: Mrs. Lopez down on Birch, the Hamilton twins, the fisherman who hummed through sermons. And then there, toward the back, entries that stopped wearing their Sunday manners. M. Hale Holdings, LLC, temporary custodial transfer, $48,000. Another appraisal variance, $0 C. Rise assessment. The notations drifted from precise to euphemistic, like a man practicing deceit in a mirror until he no longer blushes. Martin had dipped his hand in the harbor fund. Not a bucket, 2 fingers testing the water first. Enough to call a temporary custodial transfer. Enough to justify later if asked with a clever shrug. It was sunk cost. "It's back on the books." I could hear his voice, even here, wearing the suit of reason over the bones of theft. I closed the ledger because I didn't want my heart to race. Racing hearts hurry. I wanted the slow pulse of a woman who wasn't going to be rushed again. On the sill by the window lay a single brass tack, alone like a period. I pressed it into my palm, the cool circle, the pinprick sting. It felt like agreement. I folded the quilt, careful now, right side out, to let its beauty face the room that had kept its plain truth for so long. I stood, tucked the ledger, the oilskin, and the records into the trunk, then closed the lid. I have loved the sound a trunk makes when it shuts since I was small. It is a promise to open again, not a goodbye. When I stepped outside, the light had thinned to evening. The mansion's windows shone like polished teeth. I locked the shed with its hook and eye. Then, on a thought I didn't ask permission to have, I slid the hook free and pushed the door open again just enough so the night's breath could pass through, and the room might know it had a visitor and a purpose. On the way to the car, my phone buzzed like a horsefly that hadn't learned manners. A message from Martin's assistant, Ms. Hale. Mr. Hale would appreciate your signature on the shed transfer tomorrow at 10. He's arranged disposal. I typed back with a steadiness I admired in myself. Tell Mr. Hale I'll be at Whitcomb's office at 9. He can meet me there. We have other matters. I slid the phone into my coat and laughed once because there is joy in being calm in the presence of a storm that doesn't know you brought an umbrella. The gull made one last complaint and went somewhere gulls go when they don't need to be right. I drove home slower than necessary and slept less than helpful, rising twice to write my mother's name on a page because ink makes things real. I dreamed of children taking bows and a quilt held up by two women whose faces I almost recognized, and a brass key catching moonlight. In the morning, I put on my good shoes and called Grace. Bring that pragmatism of yours, I said. And a sandwich. It's going to be a long day. Whitcomb and Whitcomb still keeps its foyer like a kind of museum of the useful past. The wooden chairs announce you when you sit. The glass on the door has been repaired twice, but they left the old gold lettering that time softened and turned kind. Whitcomb and Whitcomb counselors at law. A brass bell on the desk would rather be used by someone with patience. Mr. Whitcomb came out in his cardigan, the one with elbows patched like a favorite sermon. He remembered Grace from the time she helped him set up blood pressure screenings at the parish hall. He remembered me as Miriam Brooks's girl. Memory is a kind of currency that pays even in rooms where money is the custom. Eleanor, he said, as if offering a chair in my own kitchen. What have we got? Threads, I said, and set the trunk's contents on his table. The oilskin, the ledger, the quilt folded so its right side smiled the photograph. I handed him the brass key last like a benediction. He gave each item the attention a man gives to the first bowl of peaches of summer. He did not rush. He traced names in the ledger, lips moving. When he saw Emmy Hale Holdings, his eyebrows lifted like someone hearing a hymn sung too loud. Who prepared your appraisal? He asked, mild as rain. Martin's man, I said, the one who says the marsh will chew through the footings in a decade that we were lucky to sell before the sea comes to take her pound of salt. He turned to the blue pencil folder. Reversion language, he murmured. Beautiful. You don't see this kind of clarity now? Your mother was careful. She was music, Grace said, and music is measured. Quite. He slid the codicil from its sleeve. Witnessed by my father, he added softly, as if greeting a portrait. We can check W.W. and Sons' archive. Their records moved to the county vault when their charter was surrendered. If the trust, the reversion clause, and the deed tie together, and it looks strongly as if they do, then the parcel whose usage was converted strictly to private profit after having been pledged for community education is subject to, well, not exactly a snapback, he said, but a claim with teeth. On the mansion lot, I asked. My voice didn't shake, though my ribs felt like a piano lid that had been closed too quickly. If the map and legal description align. He glanced at the quilt. It isn't just pretty, I said. It's a survey in cotton. He smiled the way men smile when their faith in the good work of women is confirmed by evidence. Let's ask the county vault to tell us if your key sings. It did. In the basement of the courthouse, where the lights hum and the air tastes like the inside of an old book, a clerk with a barrette shaped like a swallow dug in the W.W. and Sons box, then whistled when she found a metal tin with a matching sunburst stamped on its face. Would you like to do the honors, ma'am? She asked. I took the brass key from my pocket, put it in the tin's small lock, and turned. The click was not dramatic. It had the humility of a hinge that works. Inside were documents of the kind Martin calls historic curiosities when he wants to scare people into compliance. a donor deed naming the Harbor Arts Fund as beneficiary in the event of conversion from public to strictly private use. A letter from Hollis Whitney to Miriam Brooks referencing the adjoining parcel north of the schoolhouse, the parcel where the mansion now sits, being pledged as collateral to preserve public access to the arts. There were war bonds, thick paper, serious ink, payable to Miriam Brooks or her appointed successor in trust, and a small envelope marked "Recordings Keep Safe." Inside a card with 3 typed lines. 1 dedication, July 15, 1967. 2 donor message record. 3 children's chorus, keep copies. Grace dabbed at her eyes. Lord help me, Ellie, she left you a whole church in a shoebox. Mr. Whitcomb cleared his throat, which in men of his generation is how they handle tears that prefer not to be seen. What we have, he said, is not merely sentiment, it's enforceable intent. If Martin's appraisals and corporate transfers allowed him to absorb devalue and convert the pledged property well. He tapped the ledger gently. The courts are not deaf to hymns sung in numbers. Will we need court? Grace asked. Maybe, he said. More often than not, truth laid plainly on a wooden table persuades men who would do worse at a wooden witness stand. What does it mean for me? I asked and heard how small that sounded. For you, he said, it means you are not the woman they think you are, which is to say a person who can be swept aside by paperwork. You are the successor in a promise, and the shed they wanted to knock down is your testimony. He asked to keep copies. I agreed. We walked back into afternoon with the trunk repacked and the quilt over my arm like a flag. Outside the courthouse, I paused, feeling the day tilt, feeling the moment when you stop pretending a thing is random and admit it is a story being told. Eleanor Grace said, You all right? Yes, I said. I'm thinking about how mercy behaves when it has backbone. She nodded like a nurse who's heard a patient say they're ready to get out of bed. You want coffee? Later, I said. First, I want to sit in that shed and listen to a soprano who saved me without bragging. We drove back to Harbor Lane. The sky had rubbed itself pink, the way old cheeks do after a laugh. I opened the shed door, set the phonograph on the workbench, wound the crank gently, and placed the record that said, Soprano Solo M. Brooks. The needle found its groove with the small bravery of a first step. And then my mother's voice filled a room that had been starved for it. Not young, exactly. Youth is a sloppy measure, but whole. She opened a note like a window, and the air changed temperature. I cried then with the sort of crying I have made a discipline of avoiding, the kind that doesn't leave your face rearranged, but empties a little pocket of sorrow you forgot you packed. When the aria settled, I let the silence hold me. I flipped to the record labeled Donor, put it on, and waited. A man's voice, warm Carolina vowels steeped and poured. He spoke of the Harbor School of Music of land given for the keeping of song of the Brooks parcel pledged in trust against forgetting. Should this land, the voice said, be turned to private advantage only without the keeping of its promise, then let it be known that the land will remember, and the land will return. I stopped the turntable with my hand because I needed the silence to steady me. Grace, who had not said a word, put her hand over mine and left it there. My phone buzzed. Martin. I didn't answer. I let him leave a message, then another, then one more, as if the sound of his wanting could still draft my day. When the sun was nearly gone and the light bulb's hum felt companionable, I picked up my phone and called Mr. Whitcomb. Tomorrow, I said. Tomorrow, he agreed. I didn't know yet that tomorrow would be the day I watched a man kneel who'd taught himself never to bow. But the shed knew. The shed had been practicing patience for 60 years. It could wait one more night. Martin arrived at Whitcomb's office in a navy suit that had never been rained on the sort of cloth that makes its own weather. He took his chair like a man who believes chairs should feel honored. His lawyer, a woman with a face that did not volunteer opinions, set a folder down as if the table might bruise. Eleanor, he said, and his smile was the kind that measured your response for sport. Martin, I said. You look well. Busy, he admitted, which in his language is a boast disguised as a burden. I understand you wish to expedite the shed transfer. Mr. Whitcomb cleared his throat. We'll address the shed in due time. First, I'd like to understand the appraisals on the harbor parcels. I've reviewed filings from Hale Holdings and would appreciate the original valuations. Martin's lawyer slid a copy across. All in order, she said. Whitcomb smiled the way men of his generation smile when someone underestimates the pleasure they get from paper. Of course. He leafed slowly, letting the silence edit the room until it admitted its excess. Curious, he said, tapping a line. This, C-rise assessment, depressed value on Parcel B, the mansion lot, but not on Parcel C, which you acquired the following year. Same elevation, same floodplain designation, yet the variance is dramatic. Martin's mouth did a small thing quickly erased. Different assessors, he said. Market conditions shift. Whitcomb nodded, a teacher allowing a child to turn a wrong answer over like a rock. And this temporary custodial transfer, $48,000 from the Harbor Arts Fund ledger into Hale Holdings. He touched the word with his pen as if the ink might confess. Temporary implies a return. Martin's lawyer coughed softly. Was returned. Show me, Whitcomb said. She rifled, finding nothing that enjoyed the light. I'll give you time, Whitcomb said gently, which is how older men say I can wait all day. Martin looked at me then with something close to annoyance, a familiarity breaking its leash. Ellie, why are we doing this? Because a promise sits under your patio, I said, and it wants air. He laughed, good-natured enough to look like virtue. You've been talking to the wrong people. I've been listening to the right dead, I said. And they don't lie. Whitcomb slid the blue pencil folder forward like a coda. Let's look at the reversion clause. As you can see, Mr. Hale, the parcel on which your residence sits, was pledged with conditions to the Harbor Arts Fund. Conversion from public to strictly private use without provision for the fund triggers a reversionary interest claim. Martin's lawyer straightened. You can't revert a residence. You can honor a deed, Whitcomb said, and you can settle. Martin's jaw worked a small movement under the kind of control that makes a man's barber feel important. What does she want? I folded my hands on the quilt I'd brought, now draped across my knees like the lap of someone I loved. Not what you took, I said. What belongs? He looked at the quilt like it was a trick. You always did love a symbol. This isn't a symbol, I said, it's a map. He stared at me in the way men stare when they're deciding whether to be cruel. Then he turned to Whitcomb. What is your client proposing? An inspection of the county vault records, Whitcomb said. And then, we'll talk terms. Which is how we found ourselves back downstairs in that cool basement where paper rests and breath slows. The clerk's swallow barrette steady hands brought the W.W. and Sons tin. We set it on the reading table and Whitcomb opened it as if opening a hymn book. He placed the donor deed between us. I watched Martin's pupils contract. This is ancient, his lawyer said. This is binding, Whitcomb replied. Straight lines, clean dates, good witnesses. My father, as it happens. He was a stickler. Martin rubbed his forehead as if it ached. He has never liked losing track of a thing. It offends him. The trust language is clear, Whitcomb continued, gentle implacability, the way tide is gentle. Absent compliance, absent provision, the parcel reverts in interest to the Harbor Arts Trust. We can litigate, Martin's lawyer offered voice level. You can, Whitcomb said, and spend 2 years losing your calendar, or you can do what men do when they love their names. Martin bristled faintly the way a dog does when another walks by with a better stick. What do you want? He asked again, and this time the question had stopped pretending to be conversation. I want you to remember, I said. And then I want you to help me give it back. He blinked maybe at the verb. Men like Martin are not accustomed to giving back. They enjoy giving. We're done here, his lawyer said, beginning to gather. Not quite, Whitcomb said, laying the ledger from the shed beside the donor deed. We should all hear the donor's recording before we leave, for color, for context. It was an impolite request in a courthouse, but the clerk, curious, wheeled in a modest player they use for oral histories. I placed the shellac on the turntable with care and lowered the needle. The donor's voice arrived again, warm as if it had been stored with blankets. He repeated what he'd said in 1967, that this land had a purpose and that forgetting was a sin more than a mistake. When he reached the line about the land remembering and returning, the fluorescent tube above us buzzed, and I realized I was clenching my teeth. Martin stared at a spot on the table as if it would make a better past. When the recording ended, no one spoke. Then Whitcomb, who never wastes a silence, said, "Shall we return to my office and discuss a path that doesn't read well in the paper?" Martin nodded, once a man choosing a smaller knife. We walked upstairs together. Martin's steps were as steady as when he walked me down an aisle. He has always been steady in everything except kindness. Back in the office, Whitcomb poured water into paper cups as if we were at a child's birthday party, and protocol required restraint. He looked to me. "I'd like an afternoon," I said, "to write what I want clearly. I'll bring it tomorrow. 10 o'clock. I stood. "Martin, I'll meet you there." His eyes held mine, and for a second I saw the boy he must have been before he learned he could keep without asking. He nodded. "Not much. Enough." Grace and I left with the trunk, the quilt, the ledger, and a feeling like unused muscle hope that hadn't atrophied. On Harbor Lane, the gulls performed their modest opera. The shed waited, door ajar, breathing its cedar breath. "Come on," I said to Grace. "Let's set the table." We laid the quilt across the workbench like an altar cloth. I set the ledger on top, then the donor deed, then the codicil, each piece, a note in the chord tuned to the others. Grace propped the photograph of the 4 women against a coffee can full of screws, and their faces watched us like guardians who remembered our middle names. Caleb arrived at dusk with 2 folding chairs and a lantern, called by Grace because she believes a good man with strong hands improves most rooms. He's a veteran with a quiet that makes overtalkers aware of themselves. He took in the scene and said, "Nice. Smells like old churches and lemon balm," which is the kind of thing that tells you more about a person than a resume. We were drinking coffee that had no business calling itself coffee when Martin stepped into the doorway. He did not knock. He stood there taking inventory, and for a long minute no one spoke. The lantern lit the edges of his suit like a warning. "What is this?" he asked finally. "A place that remembers," I said. Caleb unfolded a chair for him. He did not sit. "I came," he said, "because I want to understand what you think you have." "I don't think I said. I know." I touched the ledger. Transfers out of Harbor Arts. Temporary. Not returned. He opened his mouth. I lifted a finger and he surprised closed it. "The appraisals depressed the mansion lot's value beyond reason," I continued. "You called it protection. It was purchase. You converted pledged land to private use without provision for the fund. The reversion clause triggers. The donor deed speaks. My mother's voice sings." I dropped the needle on M. Brooks' soprano. It would have been theatrical if it hadn't been sacred. She filled the shed with something that made our bones sit taller. Martin looked at the floor, then raised his eyes to mine and held them. It felt like a length of rope between us, frayed in places, still capable of bearing weight. "Ellie," he said softly, "I didn't set out to cheat an old promise. I know I said and meant it. You drifted." He blinked at the verb. "Yes," he said, almost grateful. "I drifted." "Drifting sinks boats," Martin Grace said. "Slow as patience, sure as tide." He swallowed. "If this goes public, everything I've built will be measured," I said. "Not destroyed. Measured." "And the children," he said, and I would have forgiven him anything if I hadn't noticed the plural. He was thinking of our grown stepchildren, yes, but also of the children in the photograph, their faces bright with a future they were promised. He wanted to keep the first and disregard the second. He wanted me to allow it because I had loved him once. I lifted the ledger and slid it toward him. He did not touch it. I slid the codicil. He hesitated. "Read it," I said. He read. I watched his face prepare a dozen arguments, discard them, settle on one. "We can fight this," he said, to the room, to the lantern, to the quilt. "We can win on technicals. We can bury it in motions until the people who care die." Caleb said softly, "That a plan you're proud to tell your grandkids?" Martin's jaw tightened. I reached into the trunk and drew out the last shellac, the one with children's choir on the label. I placed it on the turntable and began to wind. "Don't," Martin said. I looked at him. "Please," he said. I put the crank down. I moved the needle away. I waited. He took a breath I'd never heard him take, uncomposed, uncalculated, the sound of a man in a room that would not lie to him. Then he did a thing I did not expect and will not forget. He stepped forward, then another step, and then he knelt. His knees on the old floorboards made a small, plain sound. "Ellie," he said, not looking at me yet. "Mercy." He was not begging for his money. Some men only know how to ask for what looks good on paper. Martin was begging for a story, the story of himself told to the people who think he is good. He was begging for his children, the kind with his name, and the kind promised a room for song. I stood there holding still, because sometimes mercy is not an impulse. It is a considered act that must not be cheap. "Look at me," I said, and he did, and his eyes were the same blue they'd been the day he set a lily on my porch and told me my laugh made him want to be better. "I will not ruin you," I said, "but I will measure you. You will give back what belongs. You will fund the Harbor Arts Trust so the reversion is not a courtroom fight, but a gift announced by your own mouth. You will fix the record. You will not take bows. You will shoulder." He closed his eyes once long. When he opened them, pride got up, walked to the door, and waited outside. He nodded. "What else?" he asked, voice roughened. "You will apologize to my mother," I said. "She's gone," he answered. "Not in here," I said, and placed my hand on the phonograph. "You will apologize to her in this room, and the room will keep your words." He nodded again, smaller. Grace left her chair and went to the door because some moments should not be watched. Caleb fixed the lantern wick as if it demanded expert adjustment. "Stand up," I said finally, because a kneeling man cannot sign a paper. He rose like an older oak in wind. "Tomorrow," I said, 10. He looked around the shed as if it had grown in size and consequence. "You'll play the children's record?" he asked. "That's not for you," I said. "That's for them." He nodded once more, then left, forgetting to pretend he had other places to be. When his car's sound had leveled into ordinary traffic, Grace came back in and let out the breath she'd been holding. "You were right not to play it," she said. "Yes." I put the shellac back in its paper. "Sometimes mercy is the needle you lift." Caleb leaned on the doorframe. "You'll need terms in ink," he said. "I'll write them tonight," I said. Short, clear. He nodded, approving the tools I'd chosen, brevity and light. We stayed in the shed another hour, not speaking. Near closing time for the day, a child on a scooter rattled past and laughed at nothing. We three smiled like we'd been told a very good secret. My terms fit on one page. If you've ever worked in a hospital or a courthouse, you learn the dignity of one-page truth. Title to the mansion parcel reverts to the Harbor Arts Trust, to be operated as a public arts center bearing the donor's original name. Endowment funded by M. Hale Holdings, sufficient to maintain the center in perpetuity, calculated by independent accountants, with no family naming rights. Public statement acknowledging a clerical oversight in honoring legacy commitments signed by Martin. No theatrics, no self-congratulation. No criminal referral conditioned on full compliance verified within 60 days. No gag orders preventing the trust from telling the story of its founding. I slept 3 hours and dreamed of doors that open the way a mouth forgives. At 10, Whitcomb's office looked like an old ship brave enough to sail again. Martin arrived with his lawyer. He took the page, read it twice, and sighed like a man sitting down after a long standing. His lawyer objected at each line in the professional cadence that earns a person their retainer. Whitcomb answered with the cadence of the tide. Eventually, the objections lost interest in themselves. Martin looked at me across the map of the quilt. "Will you speak at the dedication?" he asked. "No," I said. "I will sit in the back and listen." He put the page down, picked up the pen, and signed his name, the way men do who learned cursive when teachers still believed it mattered. When the second signature dried, he asked if he could have a minute in the shed alone. I agreed. I do not believe confession needs a witness to count. He left Whitcomb's with the copy under his arm, his lawyer following both of them, thinned by paper. Grace hugged me so tightly my ribs learned I was loved. "Let's go hear your mother," she said. We walked the 2 blocks back to Harbor Lane. The cedar shook its green as if proud. Inside, the light bulb did its small, brave job. Martin stood near the phonograph, hands in his pockets, head bowed. "I wanted to say what you asked," he said without turning. "Then I'll go, and I won't come back unless I'm invited." I nodded, then remembered he couldn't hear nods, so I said, "All right." He cleared his throat. "Miriam," he began, and Grace and I eased back toward the door the way you step away from an altar when the prayer isn't yours. He spoke for a minute, maybe 2. I caught only the edges. "Wrong drift, sorry." When he was done, he rested his hand on the phonograph lid and left, like a man who had been told a truth he had earned. We brought in folding tables, and Caleb arrived with 3 teenagers from the VFW who wanted service hours. He measured the shed with a tape that had more than numbers in it, practical kindness, which is rarer. The teenagers fetched tools and asked questions and held nails the way a person holds a possibility. Grace organized a sign-up list with the same authority she used to reorder hospital charts. By afternoon, the developer who'd planned to raise the lot appeared, heard the words, "Harbor Arts Trust," saw Mr. Whitcomb's card, and left with a shrug you give when you know you've lost the pot to a better hand. Over the next weeks, the shed learned new phrases: joist, sistering pier, block, marine-grade plywood, dehumidifier, drain. We saved the old wood where we could and borrowed stories from the neighbors for the rest. A carpenter named Lydia sanded the workbench down to its grain and set a glass top over it so the ledger could rest beneath, visible, but safe. An artist offered to paint the old Harbor School of Music sign from the photograph carefully, with the slight irregularity that tells you it was done by a hand and not a machine. Martin's check arrived. Not a number you brag about, those are often too small, but a number that suggested someone taught him the difference between price and cost. Papers were filed, the deed moved like a quiet river to its right bed. The mansion emptied faster than rumor. The groundsmen took their tools and their stories. We kept the live oaks and the pond and the evening light. The day I carried the quilt into the big house which could not be called a house, now I stopped in the foyer and listened for the echo of a person who used to call it home. She didn't answer. The building had agreed to be something else. We kept 2 rooms as they were, because every museum needs corners that confess. One with a photographed timeline, the 4 women, the Harbor School, the note in my mother's hand. Another with a listening station where the shellac records sat behind glass, their grooves rescued and digitized, their scratches turned into texture instead of flaw. People started to stop by. Older men who remembered their sisters taking piano in a room that smelled like orange peel. Women who'd sung in the children's chorus and now sang in kitchens where grief sometimes asks for tea. They came with pie and stories and fingers that traced the quilt without touching, respectful. Martin stayed away. He sent a letter typed, then signed wet, agreeing to the opening date. He asked that no speeches mention his name, and if they did that, they mention it only as apology. I placed the letter in the archive with the donor deed and the codicil, and a photograph of my mother smiling in a way I hadn't seen since before I learned how to be practical. On a Tuesday, the postal carrier handed me a slim box with no return address. Inside was a fountain pen I had once given Martin when he made partner at an old firm that now sells its name to interns. The note said, "For when you sign things that matter." I put the pen in my purse because sometimes a gift is a ceasefire and you should honor it. Grace built a schedule for volunteers. Caleb and Lydia taught teenagers how to sand without bullying the wood. Mr. Whitcomb came by in his cardigan in a heat no cardigan deserves, and sat an hour in the cool back room with the phonograph, and closed his eyes the way a man thanks God without making him busy. We picked a date, a Saturday late afternoon when the shadows are long enough to be kind. I wrote a page of remarks, then tore it up, and wrote 3 sentences instead. One for my mother, one for the donor, and one for anyone who has ever been told that the thing they kept wasn't worth keeping. On opening day, the town did what towns do when there's a new reason to gather. The VFW men wore pressed shirts. The teenagers silenced their phones without being asked. Pastor Reed offered a prayer that managed to sound like gratitude, not credit. We strung white lights along the eaves of the old shed, now straight-backed and proud, and the bulbs glowed like small, attentive ears. The quilt hung at the far wall in a shadow box Caleb built from cedar salvaged from the original rafters. The ledger lay under glass on the workbench altar. The phonograph kept its place like a lion tamed by time. I stood near the back where I prefer to understand a room. Grace squeezed my hand until my rings lined up. Mr. Whitcomb nodded, eyes shining the way old men's eyes do when they're tired of hiding softness. A child 8-hair ribbon, a little crooked, stepped up on a box and sang Shenandoah with a vibrato that belonged to someone older. People cried in the nice way. The sound filled spaces we'd measured and hammered and sanded, but it filled something else too, the old promise so it would not echo. I did the few sentences I'd kept. My mother believed music keeps a town honest, I said. This land was given to keep that belief alive. We forgot for a while. We remember again. If you are here today, you are a keeper. That was enough. People don't need grand takes when they can hear a child sing. They need permission to call what is good by its plain name. Martin came late the way men do when they're unsure if they're welcome. He stood under the cedar for a while, hands in pockets, not interfering with the light. When he walked in, no one looked away. No one looked too long. He nodded at me across the room, the kind of nod you give when you are equal parts, sorry and grateful. He did not speak. He found a chair against the far wall and sat like he meant to learn something. When the children's chorus recording played our digitized copy, the scratch made into music, he covered his eyes briefly with his fingers and then let them fall. After, when the crowd spilled into twilight and paper cups were thrown away and folding chairs leaned against themselves in clumsy stacks, he approached. He held out a small envelope. "For the scholarship," he said, quietly. I took it and did not open it. "We're square," I said. "We're measured," he answered, and I believed he meant it. "Would you like to hear her?" I asked, gesturing to the phonograph, and he shook his head. "Not tonight," he said. "I came to hear the living." He left without ceremony. The cedar shook once in a breeze that had been waiting its turn. Grace put her head on my shoulder. "You done?" she asked. "Not quite," I said. "I have a letter to write and not send." That night, with the harbor room dark and the lights outside ticking themselves cool, I sat at the workbench with the glass removed and the ledger pushed gently aside. I used the fountain pen that came with no return address and wrote, "Dear Martin, today was good. You helped make that true. I will not forgive you for the drift that took what wasn't yours. I will not forget that you stood up when you could have laid blame down like a rug. Both will be true for the rest of our lives. If you're ever tempted to call the past a misunderstanding, come sit in this room. It won't let you. It will ask you to be better at remembering. It will ask the same of me. Eleanor." I folded the letter and placed it under the ledger like a soft shim. Before I left, I wound the phonograph once, set the needle gently, and let my mother sing for me alone. She took the high note as if it were a set of stairs that would not betray her. The room held her, then gave her back. That is all I have ever wanted from a place or a person. I locked the door behind me because even trust deserves a latch. Walking out into the kind of dark that makes stars tell the truth, I thought about Mercy. Not the kind that wears perfume and poses for photographs, but the kind that has dirt under its nails from lifting what's heavy. The kind that says no to ruin and yes to repair. The kind that measures a man and leaves him standing. The mansion ours, not anyone's, glowed softly above the pond. A child laughed somewhere near the cedar, and a gull cleared its throat as if to sing harmony, then remembered itself, and went quiet. I went home to a rental that had never tried to be more than it was, and I slept like someone who had completed a circle. In the morning, the church bell rehearsed 6 slow notes, patient as breath. I made tea and let it go cold. Some habits you keep because they remind you what you almost lost and what you learned to keep. And when I drove back to Harbor Lane, the shed looked like a person who had been told a story and believed it, spine straight, eyes bright, ready to welcome anyone willing to sit and listen.